For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Madiba. Journalist and author Bryan Rostron joins me to discuss his book titled Robert McBride, The Struggle Continues. Briefly tell us about Robert McBride. What was his role in the struggle against apartheid, and what role is he playing in South Africa today?
Well, I think Robert played an enormous role. He was born and brought up in Wentworth near Durban. And at the time, when he was in his very early 20s, such was the repression that there was very little activity. And so when he was recruited into MK by his friend Gordon, they'd been at teacher training college together, KwaZulu-Natal in particular was very quiet. So Gordon had been abroad for training, MK training, and he came back, and he and Robert recruited a few other people, and they started this sabotage campaign, but it was really a propaganda campaign. The idea was to blow up substations and so on, to really bring home the fact that MK and the ANC is here. And it was very spectacular because they did a lot, and it caused a lot of commotion in KwaZulu, which had been at that point very, very quiet. And then Robert, they had to go to Botswana for instructions and to get their guns and bombs. And at one point, his very good friend, a very close friend, Gordon, was stopped at night by police on a very lonely road. And Gordon was with his old childhood friend Becky, who was also in the thing. And the police demanded that they open up the boot, which was full of stuff that they shouldn't have. And so Gordon and Becky looked at each other and ran in opposite directions. Becky was shot dead, and Gordon was shot 3 times. He still has the bullets in him to this day, and he was taken to Edenvale Hospital, and he was in the ICU unit there under very heavy police protection. And the apartheid regime, because all these bombings in and around Durban had caused such a sensation, so that the apartheid regime made a big deal of they'd caught a big person. And Robert and his father decided that they had to get Gordon out. He was in, I think it was the 4th floor, in ICU with things stuck in him for, what do you call them, all the tubes, because he was very ill with the bullets in him. And Robert and his father at night with their comrades cut a hole in the fence, walked up 4 stories. They had white doctor's coats on with their AK-47s under their sleeves, and they just walked in saying, trying to use medical terms, but they ran out after a while, so they just kept saying, X-ray, 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 in case anyone ever heard them. And then they encountered the police on the top floor, and there was a shootout. But they managed to get Gordon, pull all these tubes out of him. This poor guy, he was absolutely naked with 3 bullets in him, in a very, very serious condition, put him on a trolley, and then had to start running down the stairs, these concrete stairs, and he kept on falling off. But the amazing thing was, as they got to the ground floor, Eden Tower, very big, and at the window, all the patients and nurses realized what was going on, was singing freedom songs. So that was a very dramatic. Then he got Gordon, smuggled Gordon out, and as I say, Gordon still has the bullets in him, and Robert continued the campaign, but then under instruction, which he placed a bar outside the Why Not and Magoo's bar on the Golden Mile in Durban, which injured a lot of people and killed 3 young women. And he eventually was caught with his comrade and stood trial where the penalty was the death penalty. Robert protected his companion Greta Appelgren and said it was him, so he got her off the death penalty, but he was condemned to death, and he spent 5 years on death row, where they never turn off the light. And I interviewed him on death row. They didn't know I was a journalist, and so I interviewed him on death row, and still on death row, and this is quite important. He was facing hanging, but in order to protect the ANC, he did not tell me that he was acting under orders. He pretended he was a rogue element and had done this on his own initiative. In fact, at the TRC, his commander from Special Operations, which was ultimately controlled by Oliver Tambo, his commander said he gave Robert the instructions. So it's interesting here. So whatever you think of what he did, here's an extraordinarily brave man who was prepared to hang. He could have said, I was acting under instruction, which was true, as a mitigation, and he may have then just got a life sentence. And I think the point of why it's such an interesting life is that he eventually, after many years, he was then got off death row, which interestingly enough was a very tense thing. F.W. de Klerk said, we, in the negotiations, we will let the other guys out, but not McBride, because he was a figure of hate in the white community then. And interestingly, some of the top ANC negotiators said to Mandela, don't stick on this. We can't derail the whole negotiation just for Robert McBride. And interestingly, it's in Nelson Mandela's official biography by someone I knew, Anthony Sampson. Mandela said, no, I'm fed up with this guy. Today we hold the line. Either they release McBride or negotiations finish. And it was de Klerk who blinked and gave in. And in fact, Robert then had been moved from death row and was serving a life sentence. And he got a call, the only call he had in all his years in prison, the only telephone call, and it was Cyril Ramaphosa saying, you're out on Monday. So, it's and since he's been out, the story in many ways is as dramatic. He had barely got out of many, many years on death row in prison. He was sent to take over the peace unit, which was actually really a war desk, because Katlehong was then like a civil war. So he stepped straight out of prison into the front line again. They sent him to take charge of the ANC self-defense units. And his life since coming out of prison has been in many ways as dramatic, including finally, obviously, when he was head of IPID and took on some of the most corrupt police.
Robert McBride says he is still fighting to bring down Babylon. How do you think McBride defines Babylon today?
Well, interestingly, Babylon, when he was a young man, various friends introduced him to literature and so on. But one of the things, and he's still very passionate about, is reggae music. And in the Rastafarian and reggae belief, Babylon represents the evil system. So, for example, when on the day that the judge, during his trial, pronounced the death sentence and then left the court, Robert turned to this very packed court and said, I've taken you this far, you now have to turn the corner. And then he said, the struggle continues till Babylon falls. Babylon meaning a corrupt system. And in a way, through his work at IPID, investigating corrupt policemen, it didn't just end one day. So Babylon really represents things that are evil or corrupt.
Can you briefly explain to us how Robert's childhood friend, Gordon Webster, influenced him to join the Umkhonto weSizwe?
Well, Gordon is in many ways the complete opposite of Robert. So perhaps that's why they became such close friends. Gordon's a very quiet, he's a very gentle man. He should have been a teacher if it had been a more normal society. And in fact, Gordon once said to me, their underground activities for MK, he said, Gordon wasn't very good at it. He was very brave. He was very brave. But Robert, he said, was born for it. He said, in a crisis, Robert goes completely calm. Whereas Robert said, in the worst situations, when, once the police were chasing them, and they obviously shot them, and Robert I forget all the details now, but Robert was very tired and he said, I can't go on, I'll rest, I'll keep them at bay. And he said, what Gordon always did in very tense situations, he cracked a joke. And that released the tension, and then they went on. So he met Gordon on his first day at Bechet Training College in Durban, teacher training college, and they became very close friends. And Gordon disappeared. In other words, he left the country for military training. And after a year or so, he came back, rang Robert, and Robert was the first person he contacted and said, look, I'm underground. I've been tasked with setting up an MK unit in the Durban area, and you're the first person I'm approaching. And Robert said, I'm in. So they're very, very, very close. And in fact, what interested me when I first read about the story before I wrote the first book 30 years ago, was that in a way it was a story of friendship, because the very dramatic situation when Gordon was wounded and in ICU, and Robert and his father Derek went in and shot their way out and managed to get Gordon over the border for treatment. When Robert was arrested, Gordon fought for a long time with MK in exile, and finally it was Chris Harney, in fact, who listened to him, and what Gordon wanted to do was come back into South Africa and try and kidnap the trial judge and hold him hostage to release Robert. So, in other words, to repay the debt. So it's really also a story of tremendous loyalty and friendship.
3 people died and 69 were injured in a bomb explosion in Magus Bar on the Durban beach after it was attacked in 1986 by an MK unit led by McBride. Tell us more on what happened that night.
Well, on that night, so in the year before, 1985, the ANC in exile at the Cowboy Conference had made a massive change. Up to that point, they said, we won't hit soft targets, but because of the oppression and innocent civilians in township were being shot, the ANC said they were going to change tactic, and that white South Africans who were living in comfort and not aware of what, not interested in what was going on, it needed to be brought home to them. So Robert rented a car, packed the boot full of explosives, and it's always known as there were 2 bars next door, and it's always known as the Magoo's Bar, but in fact it was really the Why Not Bar, which was right next door, which they were aiming at. And it was a place where off-duty policemen and army personnel met to drink. So they picked that as the target. However, in fact, the 3 young women who were killed as a result of the bombing were just young civilians. And in fact, in the book I don't gloss over it, as I go into considerable detail, and also as the car drew up, because one of them had to put a car in it was very crowded, so they had to put a car in the parking space to reserve it, while Robert brought the other car with the explosives, and then Greta pulled out, his comrade, and he pulled in. And so I cut from, as people were arriving at the bar, I got their testimony. We were approaching, we saw this car pull out, and then from his point of view, I pulled in, and so on. And also when the bomb went off, I tell it from lots of different perspectives of what the barmaid saw, and it's something to deal with. I mean, Robert is always asked about that, and I think his reply, and it's not for me to say, but I mean I've heard him say it, is that he said it at the TRC hearing. He said, I don't think I have to apologize as being a member of a liberation movement, but as a human being, it's very distressing to me to know that I did kill 3 people. And in many ways, Robert is a very divisive figure. To many people, he's a villain, and to other people, he's a hero. And in South Africa today, a lot of people still harp on about the Magoo bar bombing, which killed 3 people. And you can't gloss over that, and Robert is not, you know, he's said how he feels that, you know, as a human being, very, very sorry and very humbled that he's taken those lives. But people don't talk about the many, many instances where the apartheid forces shot 60 and killed 69 people, most of them shot in the back. The exact same people who still go on about Robert never mention that, or the many, 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 many other instances. So what a lot of people, and I'm referring to perhaps older white people who grew up under apartheid, what they don't accept, it was a civil war. And I think unless one accepts that, we're going to still be stuck in the past. And in fact, Robert was asked you know, how he deals with those people, and I think he gave a very good answer. He said, if I treat people as they treat me. If they hold out a hand of friendship, I return it, and if they're angry, I don't get angry in return, because that way you just feel bitter. So I think he's come to terms with it, but he's still very aware of the consequences of what he did.
Robert was arrested in connection with a number of sabotage incidents and the escape of Gordon Webster from Edendale Hospital. How did he handle the negotiations?
Obviously, it was a very tense time for them, because he and perhaps half a dozen other people on death. There were 300, when I was interviewing him on death, there were 300 people on death row, 296 of them black. And Robert, and I think there were about 5 or 6 other people, were MK people. And in fact, one day, while he was on death row, he and the other MK people were told, you know, come out of your cells. And they were given a jacket to put on, had no idea what was happening, and they were driven to another part of Pretoria Central away from death row, and they were in a room for about 40 minutes, and there were a lot of armed people around, and they were, what's going on? And then the door opened, and in walked Mandela. And because Robert was the nearest to him, he said, oh, hello, Robert, as if he'd known him all his life. And of course, as Robert said, it was just like heaven, because Mandela said, I know what you guys did, and we are going to get you out. So they weren't involved in the negotiations themselves personally, but they were a big element of the negotiations, because of course the F.W. de Klerk and his party did not want to release the MK people, but particularly McBride. And as I told you, you know, Mandela actually put his foot down, and F.W. de Klerk gave in.
Talking about the negotiations, please give us an insight into the negotiations that took place between the National Party and the ANC for McBride's release while he was on death row at Durban's Westville prison.
Well, it really just came down, in a way, there was quite a lot of bartering, and there was a particularly vicious racist, Baron Rostron, who had walked down the Church Street, I think it was, in Pretoria with his rifle, just randomly shooting black South Africans, just randomly, you know, innocent people on the street, and he killed a lot of them. And the Nationalist Party tried to make an equivalence between Baron Rostron and Robert McBride. And of course, there's no equivalence. Robert McBride was a disciplined member of a political party and of their underground military unit. Baron Rostron was a civilian belonging to no political party who just out of sheer racist hatred walked down the street shooting people. So there was absolutely, but they tried to make that a negotiating thing, and of course the ANC didn't fall for that. But McBride was a big pawn, as shall we say, in this chess game. And some of Mandela's advisors said, no, look, you can't let this derail. And as I told you, you know, Mandela, so really it was in a way Mandela with that extraordinary, although everyone remembers how nice he was, he could be very steely. And he said, no, this is it. If they don't give up on this, then we're stopping negotiations. And of course, he won that point. an incident of which is worth mentioning is that actually after Robert got out, the negotiations were being conducted in Johannesburg, and the AWB, the neo-fascist Afrikaans movement, got a military vehicle and smashed through the doors, and all these great big guys with their guns, these AWB guys, came in with their guns, and the negotiators were stuck in a room. You know, they took refuge in a room. And Robert got to hear about this, and he raced to the convention center where these very dramatic negotiations were going on to end apartheid. And there were a lot of neo-fascists hanging around selling their racist newspapers. So Robert, and this is where he's a very cool operator, bought one of these newspapers called Die Patriot, put it under his arm, went up to the guy who was this big Afrikaans guy with a big gun who was guarding the entrance, and said, and because Robert is coloured, as we still use that old term, the guy thought, oh, well, he's not, and Robert said, they've sent me from headquarters to help you. So the guy said, oh, great, let him in. And then Robert turns around and points his gun at him and says, now you can go. So, he's a very, very, very cool operator under very tense conditions.
McBride is now a crusader against corruption. Tell us more about his role as an executive director of the Independent Police Investigative Directorate and his resolve to tackle rotten cops.
He made a decision, which I think is correct, because he said, look, you can't use your resources to just go and try and nail a traffic cop who gets bribe someone for he says you've got to cut off corruption at the very top. And so they aimed at some of the very top policemen who were doing very corrupt tenders, getting kickbacks. They were policemen with 3 big expensive cars in their driveway, unexplained. How did they buy their big house? And of course, and we're talking about some of the very, very top, including acting police commissioner and so on. And it was very full, because it's not just Robert. I mean, some of his colleagues, as Robert pays great tribute to them, Matthew Sokoto and others, were also very brave. Because taking on these guys, what happened was that then these corrupt cops would then try and frame them for things that they hadn't done. And in fact, it was only after a while that the High Court in Pretoria issued a decree saying that policemen could not start what they called revenge investigations after they were under investigation themselves. And that's what they were doing. They'd find they were under investigation, so they'd try and throw mud in the air by starting completely fraudulent investigations against the people investigating them. So a High Court judge said that they could no longer do that, but there was a lot of underhand attempting to foil them and so on. But eventually they got through, and several of those very top guys, some have already been in court, and others are due to appear in court.
And lastly, McBride has certainly made an impact on South African history. How do you think he will be remembered?
Well, I think he will be remembered very well. It's a difficult question to answer at this moment, because let me explain. I wrote the first book 30 years ago when Robert was still in prison, and so the current book, Robert McBride, The Struggle Continues, tells the entire story, both from his childhood and so on, but up till today. But you see, Robert's only 56. So, he's led a very interesting, dramatic life, and the story isn't finished yet. So, as I said to Robert the other day, I said, when you're 65, you must write your own story, because we don't know what else he's going to do. I mean, he's going to do other interesting things, I think. So I think he'll be remembered as a very brave Mkonto fighter, I think he'll be remembered for his work in anti-corruption, which required the same sort of resolve and bravery. Yet he's 56. What's he going to? The question is, what's a guy like this going to do next? It's be interesting to see.
That was Bryan Rostron speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about Robert McBride. The struggle continues.